I spent the entire night sewing my daughter's wedding dress. Every stitch was a prayer, every thread a silent promise. And when she saw the result of all my love, she threw it in the trash right in front of her friends, called me a cheap seamstress, and told me to sit at the back of the hall at her own wedding. I was 62 years old, my hands marked by decades of hard work, and I had a heart that didn't yet know that this humiliation would be the beginning of something neither of us could have ever expected. But before I go on, I need a special favor. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. And tell me in the comments, what is your name, what city are you watching from, and write the word present. I want to know where you're listening to me from, even if it's from halfway across the world. My name is Eleanor Grace Caldwell, I'm 62 years old, and my hands aren't smooth like they used to be. They are scarred by decades of needles, thread, and fabric. Every seamstress carries her stories in her hands, and mine are a complete map of everything I've survived. My daughter, Lauren, was getting married on the last Saturday of October in an elegant ceremony at a rented hall in downtown Austin. She was 34, worked at a marketing firm, made good money, and was engaged to a man from a wealthy family. For years, I had felt her pulling away from the humble world she grew up in. But every mother believes in the love she built, and I was no different. When Lauren told me about the wedding, I immediately offered to make her dress. I felt my heart open up like fresh fabric in the sun. It was what I had dreamed of my entire life, sewing my own daughter's wedding dress, not out of obligation, but out of pure love. She hesitated. She looked at me with that expression I already knew too well, a mix of embarrassment and pity. But she eventually said yes, and I took that as a bridge being rebuilt between us. That night, I sat down at my vintage Singer machine, the same one my mother left me when she passed away, and I prayed before making the first stitch. Lord, guide my hands. May every stitch be a blessing to her. I spent days picking out the fabrics with the little money I had, ivory lace, soft tulle, and tiny pearls that a client had given me as part of a payment for an alteration. It wasn't the most expensive dress in the world, but it was the most honest. Every thread carried a wish. Every fold had a tucked-away tear. And inside, in a layer no one else would ever see, I sewed in a piece of my own bridal veil. It was my way of saying without words, take a piece of me with you, sweetheart. Even if you can't see me anymore, I'll be there. I worked for 4 nights straight, barely sleeping. The ticking of the wall clock kept me company until dawn, marking each hour like the echo of my own life slowly unraveling. When I finished, the first ray of a Friday morning sun came through the window of my little sewing room here in San Antonio and illuminated the white fabric. It was gorgeous. It didn't have the glossy finish of a luxury boutique or the price tag of a famous designer, but it had something no amount of money in the world could buy. I wrapped the dress in an old sheet to protect it and went to Lauren's apartment, holding that bundle in my trembling hands as if it were the most precious thing I had ever created. And it was. When I arrived, she was surrounded by her bridesmaids, laughing and drinking mimosas from crystal flutes, like a scene straight out of a reality TV show. Flawless, haughty, distant. For a moment, I felt genuine pride that I had raised this woman all by myself. Then it happened. Lauren looked me up and down, analyzed the bundle in my hands with an expression I couldn't quite name at the time, and asked if that was the dress. I nodded, smiling. I carefully unwrapped the fabric, as if revealing a sacred treasure. She stared at it for only a few seconds. And then, with a mocking little smirk on her face, she said a sentence that still rings inside me like a cracked bell. This looks like something out of a bargain bin, Mom. Her friends giggled softly, with that discreet laugh of people who want to be amused without looking cruel. And before I could react, before I could even catch my breath, Lauren snatched the dress and threw it into the trash can next to her desk. And she added, without even looking me in the eye, I'm not getting married looking like a poor seamstress. I felt the air rush out of my lungs all at once. I didn't say a word. There were no words capable of cutting through that moment. I simply picked my pride up off the floor, gripped my purse with both hands, and slowly walked out of that apartment before they could see I was crying. I walked to the bus stop with my vision completely blurred. The October sun was beating down hard on the Austin pavement, but I only felt cold inside. I went back home with my heart torn straight down the middle, like a ripped piece of cloth. The dress stayed on my mind the entire time, every stitch burning like an open wound. I thought about the 4 sleepless nights. About the years working on that old Singer. About the calluses on my hands. About everything I had sacrificed so Lauren could get to where she was. And I wondered, as the bus rolled through the streets of San Antonio, when exactly a mother's love had become a source of shame for her own daughter. When I got home, I sat in front of my sewing machine and stared at it for a long time. The silence of that afternoon was different from any silence I had ever known. I touched the foot pedal as if seeking comfort in the vibration of the metal, and I felt a strange impulse spark inside me. It wasn't sadness. It was something new, something deeper, something colder. It was the dangerous calm that sets in when a heart is broken and, instead of falling apart, quietly begins to make plans. Friends, I upload a new story here every single day. But YouTube will only show them to you if you hit that red subscribe button right now. Do it while I'm talking. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and you won't miss a single story. Done? Thank you from the bottom of my heart. The days that followed were heavy in a different way. Lauren didn't call. She didn't text. Not a single word of apology, no sign that what happened in that apartment had cost her a moment's sleep. I heard through the grapevine that her designer gown was already ready, ordered from a high-end bridal shop in Westlake, imported from somewhere in Europe, perfect, just as she had told a mutual friend. But perfection without a soul is just a shell. And I knew that that custom dress, as beautiful as it might be, could never tell my daughter's story. Not a single thread on that garment would know how many nights I stayed awake sewing to pay her college tuition. No seam on that European fabric would hold the memory of the Christmas we didn't have money for gifts, when I handmade her a little baby blue dress to wear to the school's holiday pageant. On a Thursday afternoon, I made a decision. I went to Lauren's apartment at a time I knew she would be at work. I let myself in with the spare key she had given me years ago for emergencies, convincing myself that this was, in fact, an emergency. The apartment smelled like expensive perfume and fresh flowers, the scent of someone living in another world. But in the corner of the living room, the trash can was still in the exact same spot. And there it was, between crumpled papers and packing scraps, my dress. Wrinkled. Stained with lipstick and leftover coffee someone had dumped on top of it. Humiliated. But whole. Just like me. I pulled it out slowly, with the same care of someone picking up a sleeping child. I hugged the fabric to my chest right there in the middle of Lauren's living room, and held it tight for a long moment before putting it in the tote bag I had brought. I took it home. I laid it on my kitchen table and stared at the dress in the late afternoon light pouring through the window. It was beautiful, even in all that misery. Like a mother who continues to love even after being rejected. I carefully ran my hand over the seams and felt that my love still lived in there, woven into every thread. And then I knew. That dress was not going to end up in the trash. For the next few nights, I locked myself in my little sewing room. I barely slept, I hardly ate, I just sewed. I embroidered tiny crystal flowers along the hem of the skirt. I added vintage lace I had kept in a small box since the 90s, brought back from a flea market in Fort Worth when my mother was still alive. And between each layer of fabric, I hid more than just embellishments. I hid my entire story. I sewed a stitch for every tear I cried raising Lauren on my own. A thread for every sacrifice I made without her knowing. A flower for every day I went invisible in the eyes of the daughter I had done everything to uplift. As the dress transformed in my hands, I too transformed on the inside. I was no longer the mother who bowed her head at her daughter's contempt. I was a woman who had finally understood that a mother's love doesn't mean enduring just anything. It means choosing what is worth preserving, and having enough dignity to know the difference. When I finished restoring the dress, I stood in front of my living room mirror for a long time. My eyes no longer held sadness. They held grit. The dress shimmered under the ceiling light, and in that sparkle, there was more than just beauty. There was justice. That was when I decided I would go to my daughter's wedding. It hadn't been my original plan. After what happened at her apartment, I assumed I wouldn't be welcome. But something inside me, maybe the self-worth I was rebuilding stitch by stitch, told me I had the right to be there. Not to ruin anything. Not to cause a scene. But because that night, Lauren wasn't just going to have a wedding. She was going to get a lesson she was long overdue for. I put on my best outfit, the same dark suit I had worn to my mother's funeral 4 years prior, the only formal wear I owned. I pinned up my gray hair carefully, not to impress anyone, but because on that day I was going to face my past with my head held high. I folded the restored dress into a white cotton garment bag with the precision of someone guarding a priceless secret. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a demand. It was an answer. A silent answer from the only mother Lauren had. When I left the house that Saturday afternoon, the November wind in San Antonio was already biting. I grabbed my old coat and walked to the bus stop, holding the bag with the dress as if it were my own beating heart. The ride to the venue was long. With every passing block, memories came in waves. The times when Lauren and I were a single unit. When she would laugh at anything with me. When she would hug me without worrying who was watching. Those memories now hurt worse than needles. The event hall was massive, with gold-accented columns and a ceiling so high it seemed to go on forever. Twinkling white lights everywhere, imported tropical flowers, crystal glasses shining on every table draped in heavy linen. Everything was flawless. Everything was hollow. I stood by the entrance for a few moments, watching the guests laugh, toast, and take pictures. Lauren was at the center of it all, radiant in her designer gown, surrounded by people I didn't know. She looked gorgeous. But there was a coldness in her eyes that only a mother can spot. When she saw me walk in, her smile froze. Before I could get close, a woman stepped in my way with a rehearsed smile. It was Lauren's mother-in-law, Victoria Sterling, the groom's mother. Impeccably dressed, smelling of expensive perfume, the kind of woman who looks you up and down without moving a single muscle in her face. She told me, in a falsely polite tone, that I could wait in the back while they took the family photos. And I obeyed. I stayed in the back, near the heavy drapes, like a ghost at my own family's party. During the ceremony, no one spoke to me. A few nodded out of obligation. Lauren didn't introduce me to a single soul. I wasn't her mother that night. I was just an inconvenient memory she preferred to keep hidden behind the thick curtains of that ballroom. The music started. The bride and groom danced. The room erupted in applause. I clapped too, with trembling hands, not out of emotion, but from the weight of a very old anger I had learned to channel into strength over the decades. I watched my daughter hug her new husband with the confident smile of someone who thinks life has finally delivered exactly what she deserves. And I wondered if she had forgotten who held her together when life tried to break her at 6 years old, when we lost everything all at once. I decided to stay a little longer, not to confront anyone, but to observe. I wanted to understand, with my own eyes, exactly when my daughter had stopped being my daughter. One of the bridesmaids came over and asked if I needed anything. I told her I just wanted to watch. The young woman looked down, unsure of what to say, and I smiled with the kind of peace that only comes when the pain is way past the shock phase. When the grandfather clock in the hall struck near midnight and the guests had loosened up, I stood up from my chair in the corner and slowly walked toward the center of the dance floor. I held the white garment bag with both hands. Slowly, the eyes in the room began to turn toward me, one by one, until the chatter of the party faded to a hum. Lauren turned around. All the color drained from her face. I unzipped the bag carefully and pulled out the dress. That same dress she had called a cheap rag. But it wasn't the same dress anymore. The ballroom chandeliers caught the crystal beads I had hand-embroidered one by one with my finest needle. The restored vintage lace looked as though it had been woven by hands that knew far more than just how to sew. It was a gown any queen would be proud to wear. The silence in the room was absolute. Lauren took a step back. Her eyes welled up with tears for the first time that night. I told her, with the firm and steady voice of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment, that I hadn't come to ruin her day. I had come to return something that belonged to me, and at the same time, remind her of who she was. That there are things a mother doesn't abandon, even when they are thrown away. I held the dress up high so everyone could see. I said out loud that I hadn't sewn that dress with money, but with sacrifice. With sleepless nights. With years of refusing to quit. That every single thread carried my story, and every stitch bore my name. Lauren covered her face with her hands. Victoria Sterling stood frozen, her champagne flute suspended in mid-air. And then the clapping started. Timid at first, then louder, until the entire ballroom was on its feet giving a standing ovation. The bridesmaids. Guests I had never laid eyes on. Even Victoria herself, who had banished me to the back of the room just hours earlier. Lauren dropped to her knees, sobbing in a way she hadn't even done at the altar. I walked over to her, brushed her cheek with my calloused hands, and told her there is absolutely no shame in coming from humble beginnings. The only shame is forgetting who taught you how to fly. She tried to hug me right then and there. But I took a step back and told her, not yet. That a real embrace has to be earned. That true love isn't begged for, it's learned. I turned around, clutched the dress to my chest, and walked toward the exit through the sea of applause. Every step was a goodbye. Every gaze I met was a wound closing just a little bit more. When I crossed the threshold of the venue and the crisp November air hit my face, I knew something had ended forever. I was no longer the embarrassed mother sewing in silence while her daughter pretended not to know her. I was a woman who had learned that dignity, too, is built stitch by stitch. If you want to know how this story ends and discover many more, hit that red subscribe button. It's totally free and it helps me so much to keep bringing these stories to you every single day. That night, when I walked out of the hall with the dress draped over my arms, the moon hung over San Antonio like an antique lantern. The party lights still reflected off the lace from the windows behind me, giving the fabric an almost surreal glow. There was no music or applause out on the street. Only the silence of a woman who had said exactly what she needed to say without raising her voice once. I walked slowly through the empty streets back to my house. Every footstep echoed on the damp pavement like another stitch being pulled tight, finally closing the gash my daughter had left in me weeks ago. I didn't cry. I had cried so much over the course of my life that tonight I was completely bone dry on the inside, like a piece of cloth left out in the Texas sun for too long. Only my heart ached. Not from sorrow, but from pure exhaustion. When I got home, I hung the dress in front of my bedroom mirror and stared at it for a good long while. It was breathtaking, far too beautiful to be ignored. But what no one knew, not even Lauren, was that inside that dress there was much more than just thread and beadwork. There was a hidden truth I had sewn in there with my very own needle. Weeks prior, when I decided to rescue the dress from Lauren's trash can, I didn't settle for just restoring it. I turned it into a silent letter. Tucked away between the layers of tulle and lace were tiny handwritten notes, carefully folded scraps of paper where I had left fragments of my story, of her childhood, of my entire soul. On one of them, I wrote that when she was born, in October of 1989 at Santa Rosa Hospital, I thought life was finally giving me back everything it had taken away. I never imagined that love could hurt so much when you give too much of it. On another, I wrote that I had sewn her very first dress out of an old flour sack, my hands full of hope and my eyes brimming with tears, and that I never knew a day would come when she would feel ashamed of that same love that kept her warm on winter nights when the heater was broken. And on the last one, the smallest, most hidden of them all, I copied a phrase my own mother used to say when I was a little girl in her house in Dallas: "The thread that ties a mother and daughter never breaks, it just pulls tight until one of them learns to let it go." I didn't know if Lauren would ever find those notes. I didn't know if she would ever have the courage to look. But I sewed them in anyway, because sometimes we plant words so they can bloom at a moment when silence just isn't enough anymore. In the days that followed the wedding, the incident at the reception spread across the whole neighborhood. Neighbors came knocking on my door to congratulate me. Some came out of nosiness, others out of genuine affection. I welcomed them, offered them coffee, and listened. But I didn't like talking about it much. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I knew, deep down, the true ending to this story was still yet to come. It arrived sooner than I expected. 3 days after the wedding, on Tuesday morning, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, Lauren was standing there. Pale, her eyes swollen from crying, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked like she had aged 10 years in 3 days. She asked if we could talk. I froze for a second. For a split second, all I wanted to do was pull her inside and hold her right there in the doorway. But something inside me, that brand new calm I had stitched together with the dress, told me to wait. I told her yes, we could. She walked in slowly, as if she were terrified the house itself would reject her. She sat down on the same wooden chair where she had waited for me so many times to finish a hem, a repair, a school uniform. This time, she gently placed the restored dress on the table, without looking at me. And she said she had found the letters. The silence filled with the sound of her shaky breathing. It was the first time in years I had seen her completely vulnerable. She wasn't the arrogant woman from the wedding anymore. She was my little girl again. She said she didn't know. That she had no idea about everything I had done for her. I looked down and told her she wasn't supposed to know. That mothers don't keep score of the stitches they make. We just sew. Lauren stayed with me for a few days. She slept in her old teenage bedroom, with the floral wallpaper I never took down. For the first time in years, we shared breakfast, small talk, and silences that no longer stung. She would watch me sew in my workroom and sometimes sit beside me trying to help, pricking her fingers and laughing at her own clumsy attempts. It was like watching my little girl come back from a distant place I hadn't been able to reach. But peace, like all fragile things, doesn't last long when there are wounds still left open. One afternoon, while we were washing dishes after lunch, Lauren's phone rang. She dried her hands and answered it. Her face shifted immediately, taking on that guarded expression of someone receiving unexpected news. When she hung up, she told me quietly that it was Victoria Sterling, her mother-in-law, and that she wanted to come over for dinner. She wanted to talk to me. The coffee mug I was holding slipped and almost shattered. To me, the woman who had banished me to the back of the ballroom like an unwanted pest wanted to sit at my table. I told Lauren it was fine to let her come, but that she'd better bring the truth, with no sugarcoating. I spent the whole evening scrubbing the house, not because I wanted to impress Victoria Sterling, but because good manners don't vanish just because other people ignore theirs. I made a simple dinner. Pot roast with potatoes, homemade biscuits, and sweet iced tea. Real food for real people. When the doorbell rang at 7, Victoria walked in looking elegant in her tan trench coat and strong perfume, the kind that tries to mask something much older. We sat at the table. For the first few minutes, nobody said a word. Lauren feigned composure. Victoria pushed her food around with her fork. I waited. I knew the truth always finds its way to the surface when nobody interrupts it. Victoria started by saying she assumed I didn't remember her. I told her I didn't recognize the face, but my memory doesn't forget voices. Her voice at the wedding had been crystal clear. She sighed and said I was right. And that was exactly why she had come. There was a long, heavy pause. Then she explained that many years ago, when she was a young woman living in a big house in Alamo Heights, her family used an in-home seamstress. A woman who sewed better than anyone else in the county and charged next to nothing. Victoria admitted she was arrogant back then. She treated the woman like dirt, demanded miracles, made her wait hours to get paid, and sometimes didn't pay her at all. Until one day, the woman stopped showing up. She found out later the seamstress was a young widow with a little girl. My hands went numb on the tabletop. Victoria looked at me with tears in her eyes and said that woman was me. The world stopped spinning for a second. I was pulled back to an afternoon decades ago, in a massive house in Alamo Heights, when I desperately needed that money to pay my rent and buy medicine for Lauren, who had a fever. I remembered Victoria's young, haughty face, her flashy jewelry, the authoritative tone demanding I redo perfect hems just to force me to work more. She had dismissed me without paying for 3 weeks of labor, claiming a hem was crooked. I desperately needed that money that winter. I told her I had no idea it was her. Victoria said she knew. That she recognized me at the wedding venue, but didn't have the courage to walk up to me because shame weighs heavier than gold. Lauren was staring at me with a look I had never seen on her face before. She asked if I had really worked for her mother-in-law. I nodded. And I told her that it was thanks to that woman's cruel words that I learned to never let myself be humiliated without my dignity again. Victoria bowed her head. She said she came to beg for forgiveness. She thought money would make her a better person. But when she saw me that night in the ballroom, holding that dress in front of everyone, it was the first time in her entire life she felt genuine admiration for another human being. That she had spent decades silently admiring the one thing she never possessed, dignity. I took a deep breath. I looked at this woman who had caused me so much grief during such a dark time in my life, and for the first time, I didn't see an enemy. I saw someone who had lived so completely blinded by her own pride for so long that she forgot to learn what actually mattered. I told her that forgiveness isn't asked for with words. It's proven with actions. Victoria nodded. And then she said she wanted to help. She knew I dreamed of having my own studio, a place to teach sewing to women who needed a trade. She said she could provide the capital to open the space. Not to clear her conscience, but to do something real with the time she had left. On the inside, a part of me wanted to refuse. To scream that you can't buy forgiveness and I didn't need anyone's charity. But another part, the wiser part one had been stitching together inside myself along with that dress, told me that accepting help when it comes from a sincere place is also an act of self-love. I told her I accepted. But on one condition. The studio would be named after my mother. Victoria asked what her name was. Grace, I answered. Because that was the only thing that had carried me through the darkest nights. Lauren stood up from the table and hugged me so tight I could feel her shoulders shaking. The dinner ended with a different kind of silence. The peaceful silence of things finally clicking into place after being lost for a very long time. The following week, Victoria returned with the contract paperwork. But there was something about her demeanor that didn't match the simple remorse she had shown at dinner. It was too much anxiety. Too much guilt. Like there was another layer underneath everything she had confessed. I asked her point blank what else she was hiding. She went pale. Her hands shook over my kitchen table. And then, her voice barely a whisper, she said there was something else I didn't know. Something she had kept secret for 30 years and couldn't carry alone anymore. She said that decades ago, she had met a man. He worked at a repair shop near her family's home in Alamo Heights. A gentle, quiet man with skilled hands and a habit of speaking very little. She said his name. Thomas Caldwell. My husband's name. My teacup slipped from my fingers and hit the floor. It didn't break, just rolled across the linoleum until it hit the baseboard. Lauren looked up, terrified. I lost my voice. Thomas had died in a workplace accident when Lauren was 6. A steel beam gave way at a construction site in downtown San Antonio on a March morning, and overnight I found myself alone with a little girl and a beat-up sewing machine that barely ran. Victoria swore she never went looking for Thomas after he married me. She had fallen for him back when they were young and reckless, but he had chosen a different path. And on the day he died, she was at the hospital. A mutual friend had called to warn her. She arrived too late, only seeing them will him away. But he had an envelope in his hand. An envelope addressed to me. Victoria pulled a yellowed envelope from her purse, its edges worn soft by time. She said she had kept it all these years, never knowing if she would ever find the courage to hand it over. And after seeing me that night at the wedding, she realized she couldn't keep it to herself anymore. My hands trembled as I took it. I opened it slowly, terrified the paper might disintegrate. Inside, Thomas's handwriting was still firm and straight, unmistakable. He wrote that if I was reading this, it was because he hadn't managed to tell me in person what I deserved to hear. That he hadn't been the greatest husband or the best father, but there was something I didn't know. That he had made mistakes before he met me. That if a woman named Victoria Sterling ever showed up, I shouldn't hate her. He asked me to tell her that he forgave her, because she too had been a victim of the same pride that sometimes ate him alive from the inside. The letter slowly slipped from my hands. Lauren picked it up and read it in silence, tears streaming down her cheeks. I stared at Victoria, who was crying with her hands in her lap, no longer trying to hide anything. And suddenly, it all made sense. The humiliation that afternoon in Alamo Heights. The crushing remorse. The desperation to make amends. It wasn't just guilt. It was the redemption of an entire lifetime. I stood up slowly. I didn't feel rage. I felt a profound, bizarre sadness, because life has very strange ways of mending the bonds we sever with our pride. I told Victoria that if she had come looking for forgiveness, she already had it. And that we could open the studio not to atone for guilt, but to build something real. To teach other women that you don't erase the past with luxury or tears. You erase it with purpose. she nodded, wiping her eyes with a cloth handkerchief she pulled from her bag. That night, after Victoria left, Lauren stood looking out the kitchen window for a long time. She asked me if everything I had been through, everything I had endured, had been for love. I told her yes. But not just for her father. For her, too. Because one day I learned that a mother's love is the only kind that doesn't need applause to keep surviving. She rested her head on my shoulder, and in that silence, I understood that sometimes justice doesn't come with screaming or showdowns. It comes with the serene peace of knowing that the truth, no matter how much it hurts, always sets you free. The next week, just as things finally seemed to be finding their balance, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a law firm in downtown San Antonio. My name was written on the envelope in elegant, old-fashioned calligraphy, Eleanor Grace Caldwell, widow of Thomas Patrick Caldwell. For a second, my heart stopped. It had been years since I had seen my name written out like that, permanently anchored to Thomas. The envelope was heavier than it looked. I tore it open with shaking hands and found a typed letter alongside a small manila envelope sealed with wax. Lauren was sitting with me at the table, and when she saw my face, she asked if I was okay. I told her I didn't know, but it seemed her father hadn't taken everything to the grave with him. We opened the letter together. Thomas's voice in those lines still felt warm, as if time hadn't managed to cool it down. He wrote that he never knew how to apologize out loud, but he always knew I understood the language of silence, and he trusted I'd be able to read between the lines. He wrote that he hadn't given me an easy life, but what he was leaving behind was worth more than money. Inside the manila envelope were documents for a savings account he had secretly opened years before the accident, depositing small amounts every month from overtime shifts he worked without telling me. It wasn't a fortune. But it was enough so that Lauren and I would never have to depend on anyone's pity ever again. And tucked beneath the documents was a brown leather-bound journal, its corners rubbed smooth from heavy use. Inside were pages upon pages of Thomas's handwriting, jotted down at different stages of life, sometimes in blue ink, sometimes in pencil faded almost to nothing. The first few pages were about us, about the day we met at a laundromat on the west side, about my laugh, about how he used to watch me sew and thought I was stitching the universe itself back together with every needle prick. Then, the entries grew darker. The frustration, the guilt, the fear of not being enough for either of us, not as a husband, not as a father. Halfway through the book, there was a sentence that stopped me dead in my tracks. He had written, "I can't stand seeing the world look down on her for being simple. She sews as if every stitch is mending the universe. And all I know how to do is tear apart what she fixes." We read in silence, Lauren and I, page by page, until we reached the end. There, the handwriting changed. It grew slower, more erratic, like someone writing through pain. They were entries from his final days, when the illness he discovered just months before the accident had already begun to eat him from the inside out. In one of the final paragraphs, Thomas wrote that if I ever felt completely alone, I should go look for the red thread. That it was in a drawer in our old house in Beacon Hill, where I kept my fabric scraps from his shop. That it was the very first thread I had used to sew Lauren's christening gown. That he had kept it without telling me. And whenever he looked at it, he remembered exactly why it had all been worth it. I couldn't sleep that night. I flicked on my bedside lamp and went to the closet where I keep my old box of scraps. The same box I hauled with me to every house I lived in, that survived every move, every brutal winter, every time I ever considered giving up on sewing. I opened it slowly. And there it was. The red thread. Fine, carefully spooled, still as vividly colored as it was 3 decades ago. I pinched it between my fingers and couldn't hold back the tears. It felt like checking the pulse of the past, as if my entire life were woven into that single red strand. Lauren woke up from the noise. She found me sitting on the floor with the open box in my lap. I showed her the thread. Her face softened in a way I had rarely seen. She wrapped her arms around me right there on the cold kitchen linoleum, and we stayed like that for a long time. And for the first time, I understood that love, even flawed love, love that doesn't know how to speak, love that makes mistakes and hoards secrets, that kind of love leaves a trail, too. Like breadcrumbs in a dark forest. You just have to be brave enough to follow them. The day we opened the Gray Sewing Studio was a bright, crisp February morning in San Antonio. Neighborhood women came by out of curiosity, some bringing torn fabric, others bringing nothing but a desire to learn. An 18-year-old girl walked in holding a shredded dress that had belonged to her grandmother, asking if it could be fixed. I told her yes. That anything can be fixed if you have enough patience and love to hold the needle. I hung a hand-painted wooden sign above the door, Gray Sewing Studio. Every stitch tells a story. While I taught the first few classes, I thought about my mother and those afternoons she taught me how to sew on buttons at our kitchen table in Dallas. I thought about my years of hunger and silence. And amid the gentle hum of the machines, the snipping of scissors, and the laughter of women learning a new skill, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Pure, unadulterated pride. Pride in myself. Lauren started working with me 3 months after we opened. She taught beginner embroidery, wearing a cotton apron I made specifically for her. She still pricked her fingers now and then, but she did it with the smile of someone realizing that the sting of a needle is very different from the sting of life. Sometimes I'd watch her from across the room as she helped a student, and I'd think about how that red thread Thomas mentioned was still weaving its way between us, stitching together what had once seemed lost forever. Victoria Sterling started coming to the studio every Tuesday morning. Not to learn how to sew, but to help with the books, answer emails, and organize supplies. There was a genuine humility in her now that I wouldn't have believed possible if I wasn't witnessing it firsthand. One afternoon, while we were folding bolts of fabric, she mentioned she had read the letter Thomas wrote her. She said she cried for 2 solid days. And that she finally understood that the dead don't rest until their truths find someone willing to listen. One Saturday afternoon, while we were sweeping up after class, a woman walked in with a 10-year-old girl. She was clutching a piece of stained, ripped white fabric. She shyly asked if we taught sewing here. I told her that here, we teach people how to start over. And I invited them in. As I showed them the tables and machines, the little girl stopped in front of the wall where I had framed Thomas's red thread. She stared at it with that intense seriousness only a child possesses, before they learn to ignore what adults refuse to see. She asked if that thread was used to sew dresses, too. I smiled and said no. That thread was used to sew things your eyes can't see. She looked at me, dead serious, and asked what. I told her, broken hearts. The little girl stared at me for a long moment, and in her eyes, I saw the reflection of Lauren when she was little, right before she learned to be ashamed of me. That same evening, Victoria fell ill. It wasn't sudden, it was something that crept up slowly over the course of the following winter. Lauren and I went to visit her several times. She lived alone in a massive house in Alamo Heights that seemed much smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had just grown larger. She always greeted us with a blanket draped over her knees and the calm smile of someone who has made peace with everything they needed to. During one visit, she grabbed my hand and told me I had saved her from herself. She begged me never to forget that. To Lauren, she said that her mother was the kind of woman born once in a century, and that she shouldn't judge me for my armor. That strength was just my way of keeping myself from shattering. Victoria passed away on a Saturday in March, quietly, without any fuss. In her will, she left a generous endowment to the Gray Sewing Studio, enough to guarantee its doors would stay open for years without us having to scrape by. And on a folded piece of paper written in her shaky, final handwriting, she left a note. Thank you for using the thread of forgiveness to mend what I tore apart with pride my entire life. I cried when I read it. Not from grief, from sheer relief. Because in the end, we had both played our parts. Her, begging for forgiveness. Me, learning that letting go of a grudge is its own kind of strength. Today, as I write these words from my rocking chair by the studio window, I can hear Lauren teaching in the next room. She and her husband had a little girl last fall. They named her Clara Grace, after my mother's studio. When I found out, I had to step out into the hallway so no one would see me break down. Clara is still too little to understand what the studio really means, but she loves lying on the rug, watching the machines run while the women work, as if the rhythmic thumping of the needles were a lullaby. Lauren says she was born listening to that rhythm, and I believe her. Some things get into your bloodstream long before you even know how to name them. One afternoon, Lauren brought Clara to the studio and plopped her in my lap while I was running a new class. The baby stared up at the framed red thread on the wall like she recognized something in it. She reached her chubby little arm up toward it with that ironclad determination babies have when they want something. Lauren told her it belonged to her grandma, and that she'd understand it someday. I smiled and agreed. I told her she'd understand the day she had to tend to her very first real wound. That's when she'd know the red thread isn't just a piece of string. It's an inheritance. It's the history of all the women in this family who learned how to sew, not out of pleasure, but out of sheer survival. Women who patched up clothes, hearts, and homes. Women who never waited around for a round of applause. Just respect. Women who figured out you don't need a lot of money to be brave. The studio grew. Women travel here from all over, from Bernie, from shirts. Some walk in carrying invisible wounds that arrive before they do, a betrayal, a loss, a careless word spoken in childhood that stayed lodged in their ribs. And whenever someone new walks through the door for the first time, I tell them the exact same thing. Grab a scrap of old fabric and start sewing. It doesn't matter if the thread snaps. I'll teach you how to thread the needle again. Because at the end of the day, sewing isn't just about putting pieces of cloth together. It's about understanding that mistakes leave marks. That scars, just like patches, are proof that a life was lived with courage, rather than fear. I close my eyes and think back to that morning in Austin when Lauren threw my dress in the trash in front of her friends. If someone had told me right then and there that it would be the beginning of our salvation, I'd never have believed them. But I know it now. The deepest cuts don't open up to destroy us. They open up so the light can finally get in. Before I wrap this up, I take the red thread down from its frame and hold it in my hands for just a second. It's still warm to the touch, it still has that vibrant color Thomas hid away for decades without saying a word. I slowly put it back in its place and think about how this thread doesn't just bind fabrics. It binds generations. It binds stories. It weaves pain, forgiveness, and hope all together on the same invisible string that connects me to my mother, to Thomas, to Lauren, to little Clara Grace, and to all the women who have ever stitched their destinies together with bleeding hands and an unbroken heart. There is no stitch pulled tighter than one made by a woman who has cried. Because a woman who has cried knows how to hold the needle with love. If you love this story, hit subscribe right now and let me know in the comments which part moved you the most. There's a new story coming tomorrow. I'll see you then.